In fifth, we have the Most Holy Trinity Church in New York, built sometime between 1882 and 1885 on land that previously served as a graveyard until 1853. According to local rumors, not all of the bodies residing there were exhumed from the graveyard, and the spirits of those left behind still inhabit the grounds to this day. The church property covers an entire city block, and it is said that there are false closets leading to bricked-up doorways, tunnels, and random sub-basements throughout the church and convent. There are also mysterious passageways on the upper levels of the church, where legend says only priests are able to enter. The church's rectory was built in 1872 by its second pastor, Monsignor Michael May, who later passed in his room on the second floor. Priests who live in the rectory have used that space for mainly a guest room ever since, as no one has ever been willing to live in it on an ongoing basis. Guests have experienced lights being switched off and on, hearing strange noises, and the sound of a person walking back and forth while trying to sleep. Phantom footsteps have also been heard on the staircases in the building, and dogs who were once kept as pets in the rectory would stare in a trance-like state down the basement stairs, as well as into the dining room when the building got cold. In 1897, a parish bell ringer named George Stell's life was taken in the vestibule of the church. Though there was a suspect in the case, a former parishioner who would later be executed for an unrelated ending of life, no one was ever convicted of the crime. The red fluids of Mr. Stell's, as well as the red handprint of the killer, is believed to still be on the wall in a stairway leading to the bell tower. George's ghost still roams the church and is believed to be the reason why the bells will ring suddenly, vowing not to leave until his death has been solved.
Number 4. Our next entry on the list today is going to be the Aquia Episcopal Church, and if you haven't said that, try saying that 10 times fast, I dare you. Located in picturesque Stafford, Virginia. The church has 200 years of history to it, which means it's also got approximately 200 years worth of ghost stories to study. When the church was first built way back when in the 18th century, it was stained by an unfortunate tragedy. You see, the surrounding areas were exhausted by war and the lack of resources, food, and money, and as such, brigands would take to the dark country roads to attack innocents during the night for whatever they had on them. Well, one young woman was hiding from a gang of highwaymen and marauders and sought out the church as a safe haven. Unfortunately, the bandits eventually caught up with her and she met an untimely end. Now, these men were never caught for their crime, and her body was not found for hundreds of years, left there to rot and decompose. And many believe that because of this, her spirit is tied to the church. And there have been several reports of hauntings ever since the discovery of those accursed bones. Visitors mention hearing footsteps frantically scattered around at night. These footsteps break into a run, but if you go searching, you'll never be able to find anyone attached to them. Voices can be heard in the room where she was attacked, some saying it sounds like a call for help or a painful scream of a struggle. Some go so far as to say they saw a transparent apparition of the woman in the church's windows or on the balcony. One story comes to us from a custodian who worked the graveyard shift there in the 1990s, claiming that he saw a ghostly woman's face floating above the graces, and says that he saw her smiling at him through the balcony windows before she vanished. One last one on this church. In the 1990s, to celebrate the bicentennial anniversary, the church sent out an invitation to a group of Civil War reenactors to fight a mock battle on its ground. During the night, one of the reenactors was complaining that there was a red and orange light that was flickering the entire night during the church that prevented him from sleeping. The man explained this to the father of the church, and the father explained back that there was no electricity in the vestry, and that the light must have been the spirit confused by why the Civil War had started up again. Imagine, you're a ghost, you're already out of time, and then you look outside and you see guys from your time? My little ghostly sense of the world would be so thrown off. I would have to buy a new ghost calendar. Number 3. Monaster Nagayal Duff, or Abbey of the Black Hag if you don't got all that time. Wow, you see that? You see what that church is called in that little chyron below me right now? I'm just supposed to pronounce that with my lips? Okay, it's also called the Abbey of the Black Hag, and that's what we're going with. We're not calling it that other thing. I'm not doing that. Black Abbey of the Hag, only name this church has ever gone by, and it was built in 1298. And it was one of the well-known medieval convents in Old Ireland. The remains of the abbey still stand today in a secluded valley, making it already mysterious and supernatural place just that much more supernatural and overgrown and spooky. I mean, the place is called the Abbey of the Black Hag. You don't name a place that unless it's extremely haunted or if there's like a cool boss fight or something there. Sounds like it's straight out of Dishonored. It's believed that the last abbess, horrible word by the way, in charge of the abbey practiced witchcraft, and in the scary way, okay? She brought death, misfortune to the surrounding areas. Pope Martin V condemned the abbey. not being down for witches at all. The accused witch left to live out in the damp, deserted abbey by herself, which she probably loved because it sounds scary. Over time, her skin blackened, her hair furled, and her soul twisted, leading to the place being renamed the Abbey of the Black Hag. And if you can believe it, there's actually more to this one. The Count and Countess of Desmond once called the abbey home when attempting to flee their attackers, where the Countess was fatally struck by an arrow and buried by her husband. But it wouldn't be the end of the Countess, because sightings of a ghostly figure around the ruins of the abbey were common, meaning someone eventually went to dig up that grave, finding worn out finger bones, meaning she was still alive when she was buried. It's said now that a woman's panicked shrieking can be heard in the early hours around the abbey. Number 2. The Borley Rectory. The Borley Rectory is an old London estate that has the unique distinction of being considered the most haunted building in the United Kingdom. No big deal, or anything. Almost immediately after its construction, stories of hauntings started to creep out. One of the first local legends says that in the 12th century, a priest and a nun had a naughty little affair, and when they were discovered, the nun was bricked up and left to rot in the nearby church. Since then, they say that her spirit roams the rectory. In 1900, 4 daughters of the then estate owner all said that they saw a nun wandering around the estate late at night. They tried to talk to her, but got no response back, just a scary ghost stare. The family claimed they'd see this nun around the property, and on one occasion they thought they saw the spectral apparition of a horse-drawn carriage with a headless rider, some real Sleepy Hollow stuff. From there on, there was all these reports of bizarre sounds or strange shadows creeping out the corner of your eye. In 1927, the estate changed hands, as the original family owning the estate had all passed on, and a new family, the Smiths, had moved in. Shortly after, they discovered a human skull in the cupboard in a brown bag, which is not a great housewarming gift, to be honest. They reported poltergeist behavior, unexplained footsteps, lights flicking around them, and the same sightings of headless specters. Now, they only lasted 2 years, not being down for any of the hauntings or skulls in cupboards, any of that business. And the next family, the Foysters, didn't have much better luck. They had objects flying around their home, and on one occasion claimed their daughter was attacked by something truly horrible. They moved out as well. And the last owner of the rectory would be Captain Gregson, who accidentally lit the estate ablaze while unpacking, although insurance claims they think the fire was started intentionally, perhaps in a desperate attempt to cast away whatever evil has been trapped in the Borley Rectory for so long, or perhaps he unintentionally unleashed it out into the world. Time will tell.
And finally, number 1 on this list is Nidaros Cathedral. This is not only Norway's most important cathedral, but also one of the most haunted as well. I mean, in all honesty, it literally looks like Dracula's castle if Dracula's castle was a cathedral. It was constructed in the 1300s, but the actual hauntings didn't begin until relatively recently in its lifetime. In 1924, Bishop Mary Gleditch saw something pretty scary and gruesome. The ghost of a monk who had a massive slash directly across his neck. Ever since that day, this monk is seen very regularly. Nobody knows why though. People and historians have looked through the history of this cathedral and can't seem to find any record of a big monk population ever staying here. However, it doesn't make sense that this random monk ghost would just show up out of nowhere, so you have to imagine that he was here at some point before. You also have to imagine that he got that cut on his neck here too. All of it is very dark and mysterious and makes you wonder what else happened here that wasn't documented. Number 5 on this list is the Borobudur Temple. Borobudur Temple is located in Indonesia and is frankly extremely beautiful. It's located on the island of Java and is one of the biggest Buddhist temples in the entire world. It truly looks like something from a legend or from something directly out of an Indiana Jones movie. Now, it was built many hundreds of years ago between 780 AD and 840 AD during the Selandria dynasty. There's a lot of lore that surrounds this temple and a ton of mystery. Located in a very remote location, it kind of got forgotten about for several hundred years. Then in 1970, it was almost rediscovered by UNESCO, and it was decided that they would try and rejuvenate it to its former glory. Now, during the process of rediscovering this beauty, they also rediscovered the darker side of this place, which has people believing, at least at one point, the devil may have been hiding here. Gruesome visuals etched into the interior of this temple depicting some just horrible things. Torture, beheadings, displays of sheer violence that I can't get into detail on YouTube about. Some awful drawings showing what would have gone down here at one point in history. Also, along with these acts of violence, some drawings that seem to point to the presence of the devil. Drawings looking at potential rituals that would have been performed in honor of this devil. People worshipping the devil and praising him, all of that. Nowadays, it's pretty understood that this place no longer hides the devil. But for several hundred years, it's very possible this could have been a bit of a stronghold for either the devil or another evil spirit. Number 4 on this list is the Ness Church. Ness Church is a Norwegian church that is no longer operating. It's a collection of ruins now and a very popular spot for ghost hunters. The ghost hunters have discovered that electronic equipment, or your standard cell phone, isn't going to do so hot in this church. For whatever reason, the second that you bring anything like that in, it just completely shuts down. If one wants to have an electronic device here, then it needs to be specifically made to withstand strong spiritual energy. The most popular myth surrounding the ghostly presence that resides here is a priest named Jacob Christian Finnegan. This was a priest who presided over this church from 1800 to 1837. Apparently, he suffered a very grim fate here along with his children. It's thought that he and his children were killed by an evil gang who came through the church looting it. They killed the priest and then, ever so cruelly, bricked his children up and left them to die. This is only one variation of the tale though, because one legend actually says that the priest did this to his kids himself. Regardless of which one is historically accurate, they're both pretty bad. The screams of these children are frequently accompanied by the sighting of this priest. It's said that he will stalk those who come here and follow them around, giving them a horribly uneasy feeling. It's very likely that if you go by yourself, this ghostly priest will attack you and could do some serious damage. Maybe he wasn't evil when he was alive, but he certainly is now. Number 3 on this list is Greyfriars Kirk and Churchyard. As the name Greyfriars might hint, this church is located in Scotland. History Hit says, with the kirk tracing its origin to 1598 and the graveyard dating back even further to the 1560s, Greyfriars Kirk and Kirkyard in Edinburgh is said to be one of the most haunted religious sites in the world. Known for body snatching and violent ghosts, the famously fearsome site has even been referred to by Scottish poet Robert Louis Stevenson. The site's most famous ghost is the Mackenzie poltergeist. George Mackenzie, who was known during his lifetime as a ruthless persecutor of Scottish Covenanters, a Presbyterian movement in the 17th century. His spirit was reportedly released in 1999 when a homeless man looking for somewhere to sleep broke into his final resting place, the Black Mausoleum. Next to this mausoleum is the former Covenanters prison, which housed some 1,200 members of a failed anti-government revolution in 1679. Only 257 prisoners came out alive, with the remaining dead said to haunt the churchyard. The negative energy that surrounds this church is said to be so strong that it's attracted some pretty powerful beings. The devil is the one being that people associate with this place. Some believe that this church is actually a secret lair for the devil, that these other demonic spirits are working to keep us away from this place so the devil can fulfill his evil agenda. If this is the case, then I think that we should do as the devil wants and leave it alone. Number 2 on this list is Borley Rectory. Built in 1863 in England, this is one of the most famous haunted churches in the world. We can thank the personalities of Ed and Lorraine Warren for bringing it into the spotlight, as they had quite the experience at this church back in the day. The horror stories began back in 1929. A journalist named V.C. Wall was a photographer in the woods nearby the rectory, taking pictures one evening when they saw something very strange. From the outside, the rectory looked like it had a light on, but if you walked inside, it was all dark. Wall also saw the ghost of a nun that evening walking around the graveyard, looking as eerie as you may expect. After they told people about this story, some ghost hunters came forward and provided an explanation. Back in the 1300s, there was a monastery here. At this monastery, a monk had a relationship with a nun. This was found out and resulted in deadly punishment for both people. The nun got it particularly bad though, because she was bricked up alive in the convent walls and left there to die. The 1929 story was the big one that kicked everything off, but after this happened, other stories started emerging. Stories about this land before the rectory was even built. Apparently this area of land was always haunted and dealing with ghostly presences. Strange rapping sounds, bells ringing, objects moving and flying around without anyone touching them are all very common sights at the Borley Rectory. The ghost of this nun is also a regular character here, making herself known to newcomers quite often. You may even see the ghost coach. A headless phantom coach driver is said to be around the area and will approach people every now and again and take them away. Why anyone would ever get into a coach driven by a headless ghost is beyond me, but apparently it happens. Everything about this rectory and land is evil, and it needs to be avoided.
At number 1, Mortimer Abbey. Mortimer Abbey is a monastery in the forest of Lyons, France. A real old church built in 1134 on marshland, near the stagnant water of the drainage lake. The monks dug it out to try and dry the marshy land around the Fulbrock stream, which was called the Dead Pond. In French, Mortemont, which is where the name comes from. You can kind of hear it there. Mortimer, you know. Perhaps it's this history of being built on a dead pond is why Mortimer Abbey was doomed to be haunted. Now the abbey flourished for centuries, but over time started to become claimed by the passage of time, and it fell into decline and disrepair. In the 17th century, there was an attempt to try and rebuild the abbey and recapture its former old glory, but the decline was already pretty present and had set in by that point, and by the time of the French Revolution, only 5 monks still remained in the abbey. Eventually, the abbey would collapse entirely and go private, and in 1863, the abbey would find itself in the hands of a rich Parisian family, the Delarue. Mr. Delarue moved his wife and his sons into the abbey, but soon discovered they weren't the only tenants. While walking the lawns, the young people of the house saw a light from the library. As if by an invisible hand, these hatches unfastened, their handles turned, and the windows and doors all opened. The paintings on the inside of the abbey turned themselves around and steps thundered out into the halls, and nobody moved out immediately after. I would have started looking for new real estate right then and there. But one night the young Delarue, Charles, had his fiancée over to come see the estate that would become her new home in marriage. She was offered the guest room, but found herself terrified during the night when she couldn't sleep because she was too busy being tormented by mysterious sounds and objects around the room that were hurling themselves around, being possessed by something. Having had, quite frankly, enough, like I think any of us might have, the young suitor announced she would never live in this house, called off the entire marriage, and hurried back to Paris tout de suite, where there were plenty of handsome young men asking her hand in marriage who didn't live in old haunted estates, okay? That's the message to take away from this. Get the love you deserve, and the love you deserve is not in a haunted house.
Number 5 on this list is the Lady of Guadalupe Church. This church is located in New Orleans and is known to the locals as being one of the most haunted spots in the whole city. This location hasn't always acted as a place of worship, but for a long time was a chapel that you really didn't want to end up at. That's because for the longest time it was actually called the Old Mortuary Church. As I'm sure that you can probably guess, the crowd that entered this place wasn't the liveliest. In fact, using the word live to describe them is just flat out incorrect. New Orleans was hit hard many a time with epidemics, with yellow fever being especially bad. There were times during the city's history where the dead were too many to handle and they had to go somewhere. Enter in the Old Mortuary Church. Thousands upon thousands of bodies have went through these doors over the years. In fact, for the longest time, the only people this place saw were the pastors who were here and the countless dead. Everyday citizens were too scared to come here for fear of catching the disease and wouldn't even risk going to see their departed loved ones. Obviously, all this death has left its ghostly mark. Eventually, it was turned into a full-fledged church that people attend, but not before the spiritual damage had been done. Nowadays, the spirits of some of those who died during this harsh period in New Orleans history still haunt the area. Glowing orbs have been seen by those who frequent the church, floating around at nighttime. Subtle and faint moans can be heard echoing throughout the walls, as if the moans themselves were wind blowing through the church. The ghost of a man has said to approach people from time to time, claiming he needs help and that he was never sick to begin with. This is definitely one of those churches who's seen its fair share of tragedy over the years, and it shows. However, believe it or not, it may not be the most haunted church in New Orleans, but more on that later. Number 4 on this list is St. Helena's Chapel of Ease. This chapel is located in South Carolina and is a ruin of its former self.
In at number 4 we have Borley Rectory. Established in 1862, the building was originally built as a house for the residences of the parish rector. The earlier rectory had burned down to the ground in 1841 and then was replaced in 1862. Borley Rectory itself is a tiny rural community in Essex that had 110 inhabitants at its peak. Now just a shell of a rectory left abandoned. Now the ghost stories don't start once the building was abandoned, but there had been claims of ghostly activity on the site from as early as 1819, with a shadowy nun being seen gliding across the ground where the rectory was built. By the time the Bull family moved in, there were reports of the sound of rushing water in the house and bells ringing from unknown sources. There were also reports of disembodied sounds of crashing and heavy footsteps in empty areas of the building. As with so many cases of alleged poltergeist activity, much appeared to be in the daughter of Ethel's room, being the subject of many hauntings. In 1900, Ethel saw what looked like a nun hiding in the trees, and as they reached out to the nun, the figure dissolved in front of her very eyes. As years passed, household items went missing. There started being mysterious messages appearing on the walls of the home. With the increase of hauntings, the owners hired a paranormal investigator of Harry Prince, after years of not being able to find a new owner as people were scared that the church was cursed. In at number 3 we have Most Holy Trinity Church. The Most Holy Trinity Church can be found in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. With the present day church is the third church built upon the grounds and was established in 1885. The church is known to be built on a site that had been a cemetery prior to being a church. Legend has it not all of the bodies were removed from the cemetery and that the souls of those who remain continue to inhabit the site. Not only that, but a number of people have mysteriously died while praying in the church since its doors first opened in 1885. Thus, those souls are also said to roam throughout the church building. Because of this, the lights in the church have also been known to go on and off without any reasonable explanation. At night, it is said that voices and the sounds of people walking back and forth can be heard in the building. It's been reported that priests who live in the rectory have continued to reserve the space as a guest room ever since the haunting started, as no one has ever been willing to live in it on an ongoing basis. Guests report having heard strange noises and the sound of a person walking back and forth while trying to sleep in the room. Phantom footsteps have also been heard on the staircases in the buildings, and the dogs who were once kept as pets in the rectory would stare in a trance-like state down the basement stairs, as well as into the dining room when the building got cold. With the number of souls trapped in the building and scary ghost stories throughout the years, it's hard not to believe that this church is cursed by the devil. In at number 2 we have the Abbey of the Black Hag. The Abbey of the Black Hag lies in the centre of the West Limerick in Ireland. It has been a source of paranormal and archaeological intrigue for centuries. It is named after Catherine D. O'Connell and was originally thought to be 13th century due to Vatican records. However, it may be 100 or so years older than this. St. Catherine's Augustinian Abbey was one of the few medieval convents in Ireland during the 1290s. Pope Martin V closed the convent after the locals were terrified of one nun practicing black arts and witchcraft within the abbey, which is known as the Black Hag's Cell. Due to the black magic performed on the grounds, it said that it brought bad fortune to the local population. The malevolent abbess was left to live out her days in the damp, deserted abbey. Due to the depraved conditions and her twisted practices, over time her skin blackened to such a degree that it gave rise to the local name for the convent, the Abbey of the Black Hag. While it's said that one ghost that haunts the convent is the Countess of Desmond, who was buried alive under the church's altar. Sightings of her menacing ghostly figure prompted an investigation of her grave, while visitors say you can hear her screams and scratching the stone to escape in the early mornings throughout the ruins of the abandoned church. And finally, in at number 1 we have St. Louis Cathedral. The cathedral located on Jackson Square, St. Louis Cathedral is actually the 4th cathedral built upon its current location. The cathedral is the oldest continually operating cathedral in America. The two buildings which used to house the congregation of St. Louis's cathedral were destroyed by unfortunate events. The first building used as the cathedral was lost to a hurricane in 1722, just 4 years after the city's official founding. The cathedral, which replaced the earliest structure, then burned to the ground in New Orleans' Good Friday fire in 1780. 1888. The third itinerary of St. Louis's cathedral was built in 1794, but by mid-1800s the congregation decided that they wished to enlarge their parish church. Thus the fourth version of St. Louis Cathedral went up in the 1850s. Perhaps the most famous ghost associated with the St. Louis Cathedral is that of Père Antoine. Père was a Spanish Capuchin friar at St. Louis Cathedral. He arrived in New Orleans in 1774 and was named pastor. His generosity and kindness to the people of New Orleans made him very popular. He was well liked by all of New Orleans. His death on January 19, 1829 was met with a somber and mourning city. He was laid to rest inside the St. Louis Cathedral 3 days after his death. Since his death in 1829, the ghost of Père Antoine had been seen in St. Louis Cathedral by an untold number of people. His ghost is easily recognized as there is a portrait of him inside of the cathedral. It seems as though the ghost of Père Antoine especially likes to show himself around the holiday seasons. Commonly, the ghost of Père Antoine is seen near the altar and on the balconies. Interestingly, the ghost has been seen in other areas of the city as well, especially in the alley next to the cathedral. In addition to that, the ghost of Pierre, there are other famous ghosts associated with St. Louis Cathedral. Some of the ghosts which are said to haunt St. Louis Cathedral, like that of Père Dagobert, who became pastor of St. Louis Cathedral in 1745. On quiet evenings after worship, people have seen the ghost of Dagobert walking the aisles of the cathedral, his head down to the ground, walking silently in sandals. Coming in at 5, St. Paul's Episcopal Church, Key West, Florida. St. Paul's Church is the fourth church structure built by St. Paul's between the 1800s and early 1900s. And though it may look bright and new, this is because the church has been rebuilt numerous, and I mean numerous times. The original church, made of coral rock, was completed in 1839. However, it was destroyed during the Havana hurricane in 1846 and was rebuilt in 1848. Once again though, the church was destroyed when the Great Fire of Key West struck in 1886. However, by some good fortune, the rectory survived unscathed, and the rebuilding once again began on the third structure, ending in 1887. However, disaster struck once again though in 1909 when the church was destroyed by a powerful hurricane. This time though, the parish hall survived, as well as the rectory. The church was once again rebuilt and construction was completed in 1919. However, during all of these rebuilds, it was discovered that the site was once a Seminole burial ground, with the land being previously owned by the Fleming family before the church was built, and the land was only granted after the widow was assured her husband's remains that were interred on the land would not be disturbed. However, this is where it gets spooky. Legend has it that the promise was broken and the widow's husband, John William Charles Fleming, was removed from the site. Spookier still, according to some locals, his ghost still wanders the site. Other apparitions have been reported as well in the graveyard, one being a ghostly group of children who were killed in a fire set by a jealous deacon who was taking revenge on his unfaithful wife. Yeah, yikes. Coming in at number 4, we have St. Mary the Virgin, England. In an English village, you'll find the Church of St. Mary the Virgin, built around 1350 just outside the main settlement. The church in Clophill, Bedfordshire, was abandoned for around 170 years after it fell into disuse in the 1840s. There are a few odd things about this ancient little church, the most significant being that it was supposedly built facing the wrong direction. Churches are traditionally oriented to face east, the direction from which the sun rises, which in the Christian religion is associated with the location of heaven and the return of the Messiah. Churches are positioned with the altar facing east, so people will pray in that holy direction. Some have claimed that because St. Mary the Virgin Church faces away from God, it thus opens its doors to hell. Indeed, the church has a long history of reported hauntings and supposed satanic rituals. The 14th century church was reportedly used for satanic rituals in the 1960s. As rumor has it, bones were dug up and arranged in satanic patterns. Paranormal investigator has speculated that some kind of black magic was performed at a church in Clophill, making it one of the most haunted places in Bedfordshire. The investigator explained that there's definitely something strange going on at the church, and this personal view is that it's down to black magic practices held there. He explains that he has also had many people confess the terrifying experience that they've had with the church. One filmmaker told the investigator that he saw a dark shape that was extremely tall coming towards him. The filmmaker and his colleague ran when he felt something grab his arm. come, even though he couldn't see anything. Once police arrived to the scene, instead of laughing the claim off, they congested that they've spent a lot of time guarding the abandoned site, as many people experienced the same thing. Over the years, many people have reported seeing strange things near the church, from mysterious hooded monks to tall dark figures. In at number 3 we have Egg Hill Church, Spring Hills, Pennsylvania. Considered one of the most haunted churches known to man, we have Egg Hill Church in Spring Hill, Pennsylvania. The church was built in 1860 and was out of use by the 1920s. The most well-known story about Egg Hill Church is of the great number of people that supposedly lost their lives. This occurred at the turn of the century in the 1800s, when the pastor at the time ended the life of his whole congregation by poison and kept them in the nearby woods. Other stories say that the pastor only ended the life of the people of the parish. He reportedly would end their lives one by one under the mysterious circumstances and got away with it, until the day that he would be discovered, where he would end his own life in the church. Some who have been to the church say they have seen drawings of pentagrams and goats appear on the walls and ceilings, written by some unknown entity. Others say that from outside the church you can hear strange noises coming from the inside when the church is locked up and supposedly empty. Some claim the sounds are similar to children's voices. Therefore, there is no doubt that this haunted church has the potential to be cursed by the devil. In at number 2 we have Aquia Episcopal Church in Virginia. This church is said to be one of the most haunted churches in Virginia. Legend says that the church and the church graveyard, which has graves dating back to 1738, are both home to paranormal activity that has taken place for over 200 years. Even the early years of the church being opened were marked with tragedy. In the mid-18th century, a woman was hiding from a group of men within the church's walls and lost her life. Even more upsetting was the fact that she was not discovered until years later, when the church reopened after the Revolutionary War. No one knows exactly the details of the loss, yet there have been several claims of paranormal activity since. Her hair just as blonde as the day she lost her life. At that time, the church had lost funding due to the Revolutionary War, and that might have been the reason why no one discovered her body until later. Moreover, it's been said that blood stains from the murder remained on the floorboards for nearly 100 years, till it was replaced altogether with concrete. Many ghost stories worked their way through the community after the skeleton was discovered. Many parishioners refused to set foot in the church after dark. In the 1900s, people decided to seek evidence of hauntings for themselves. Many returned with chilling tales of having encountered an unfriendly presence. Built before the Civil War, this church is reportedly visited by the ghost of a soldier killed during the conflict. The most haunted part of the building is the church tower. Others claim that the reason for the haunting involves a young woman who was murdered there. The eerie lights and unexplained sounds are reason enough to stay away after dark. Even today, there is plenty of paranormal activity associated with the church grounds. Many visitors have reported hearing footsteps running through the graveyard, accompanied by the sound of a violent struggle. Others claim to see the figure of a young golden-haired woman peering from the balcony window. With all the tragedies and loss of lives that happen within the walls of this church, not to mention the paranormal activity, it's safe to assume that there is some evil spirits and energy cursing the church. And finally, in at number 1 we have St. Columcille, Ontario. Dating back to 1855, St. Columcille Church was founded and located in the hamlet of Uptergrove. The original frame church was torn down and the present brick edifice was constructed in 1905. This structure sits on a hill far back from the road and can easily be viewed when driving on Highway 12 east from Aurelia. The ghost stories have been spreading since over 100 years ago, classifying the church was haunted, and these tales have been circulated ever since. Today, the church is deemed haunted by some local residents and visitors. There have been many reports of ghost sightings, shadowy figures that will suddenly appear, creaking doors, and eerie music that will play randomly from the organ. There have also been numerous reports of shadowy sightings of a figure wearing a black hat that floats through the choir area, creating chills for those who had observed it. Mysterious candlelight has been seen flickering from the windows on stormy nights. Many believe the spirit responsible is that of a former priest who, according to legend, pledged to complete a specific number of sermons, though he lost his life before he was able to attain that number. Now, some churchgoers say he is returning to fulfill that promise.
Number 5 on this list is Hallstatt Karner. Hallstatt Karner is one weird church, man, let me tell you. I'm all about unique and cool decorations, but human body parts? kind of where I draw the line, guys. Discovery.com says many bone churches and ossuaries are decorated with femurs and pelvises, but at Hallstatt these skulls themselves are decorated. More than 600 of the skulls on display in this Benhaus, also known as Bone House in English, bear their former owners' names, professions, and the date of their death. Many are also adorned with decorative garlands and flowers. But perhaps what makes this bone church stand out the most is the fact that the most recent remains to be interred here belong to a woman who passed away in 1983 after having requested the Benhaus as her final resting place. What's more, she might not be the last because the church is still open to receiving similar requests. So yeah, the dark secret here is that there is literal bones still being added. 1983 is really not that long ago when you think about it, and like the article suggests, that's probably not the last person to have been thrown into this array of skeletons. I guess it isn't, but it feels like this should be illegal or something. At the very least, it's just super weird. Like, why is a bunch of dead bodies and bones and stuff bringing anyone closer to God? Isn't the whole point of church to connect with your spiritual side? Not get grossed out by a bunch of dead people who you might have even known at one point. The church is located in Austria and has got to be one of the scariest churches in that country for sure. Unless you want your bones to be added to some religious display, I would stay away from this place.
Moving on to our fourth place position, we have the Aquia Church of Stafford, Virginia. While the congregation was established in 1711, the physical parish wasn't built until 1751. It was a gorgeous brick building built on a peaceful hilltop with a two-story crucifix floor plan, which otherwise known as a cruciform, which was considered a rather unusual style for colonial churches. Aquia was built to replace two earlier sites of the Overwharton parish, which were constructed around 1680. The inside of the church burned down in 1754 and was not rebuilt until 1757. It was then shut down from the Revolutionary War until the Civil War due to lack of funding, before reopening as a stable, campsite, and hospital for Union forces. It was during this closure that a young blonde woman was traveling the dark country roads, rural Stafford County, when a group of highwaymen accosted her. This time period was full of exasperated uncertainty from the war, and with it a severe lack of resources, food, and money. Men would wait hidden on the side of roads to steal the valuables from people walking or riding by their hiding spots. She ran from the men to the sanctuary of the church, but was only able to hide for a little while before they broke inside and ended her life. Her body was hidden in the tower, and the men were never caught. It wasn't until after the Revolutionary War ended in 1775 and the church was ready to reopen for services that what was left of her was discovered, a skeleton with golden blonde hair that was as intact as if she had been freshly slain. The red fluid that spilled on the floor from her death was impossible to remove. Despite using every trick known to man, the stains remained in the tower for well over 100 years, until during a modern renovation when the redness was covered up by concrete. With the facility still being in use today, members of the church have mentioned hearing footsteps walking around at all hours of the day and will break into a frantic run around the church at night, but no one is there. Noises can be heard in the empty tower, with some saying it sounds like a struggle, others describing a groan, whistle, or even a call for help. Many have also mentioned seeing a transparent woman in the church's windows, on the balcony, or even in the graveyard, dubbing her Blonde Beth after the hair of the skeleton. In the 1900s, brave people would try to stay overnight at the church, but were chased away by what they described as an unfriendly presence. A custodian working in the graveyard saw a ghostly woman's face floating above the graves, while another man saw a woman smiling at him through the balcony windows before she vanished. In the middle of this creepy sandwich, in third place, we're taking a closer look at St. Mary the Virgin, located on the outskirts of Clophill, England. Originally built facing the west sometime around the year 1350, it's believed to have been erected on top of a leper hospital run by monks. I'd like to take a moment to note that it was built in the quote-unquote wrong direction, with churches traditionally facing east, the direction from which the sun rises, which is associated with the location of heaven and the return of the Messiah in Christian religion. Altars inside of these holy buildings would face in the eastbound direction for prayers. Some have claimed that because St. Mary the Virgin faces away from God, it thus opens its doors to hell, and ergo responsible for the tale I'm about to tell. The building was abandoned in 1848 when the rector at the time made the decision to have a new church built, instead of expanding the previous one, which was much needed due to the rapidly growing congregation. Old St. Mary's, as was dubbed by the locals, was then primarily used as a mortuary chapel, holding bodies before they were buried in the adjacent cemetery. By the 1950s, St. Mary's had become so run down that it could no longer fulfill that use, with just the outdoor walls and tower remaining. In March 1963, the tomb of an 18th century apothecary's wife was broken into, and the bones were arranged ritualistically in the middle of the church. And once again, on Midsummer's Eve of 1969, multiple women's graves were broken into, with bones being removed and rearranged once more. While the specific individuals involved in these acts were never identified, the arrangements found resembled those used in black mass rituals performed by satanic groups at the time. After the first incident in 1963, a rare decision was made to rehollow, or in more simple terms, re-bless the altar that was left in the building, in a failed attempt to protect the building from evil. Later that year, Reverend Harold Colthurst reported stumbling upon a group of men in the building that were in the midst of a mysterious ritual, being quoted as saying that the men were trying to communicate with evil spirits, chanting some sort of mumbo-jumbo. They were definitely in league with the devil. Modern-day visitors to the now landmark have reported seeing a plethora of ghostly figures during the day and nighttime, faint lights moving about before vanishing mysteriously, along with reports of a chilly and oppressive atmosphere even during warm days. In second place, we're visiting l'Abbaye de Mortemer, or Mortimer Abbey. It was originally built in 1134 on land gifted by King Henry I. The stagnant water of the drainage lake, which was dug out by the monks to dry up the marshy land, was called Mortemer, or the Dead Pond, giving the monastery its name. Totally not ominous or anything. The monks constructed what was then one of the largest monasteries in the world on said land. The legend says that after the passing of his only son, King Henry wanted to reform his daughter Matilda and had her locked in a room in the abbey for 5 years. The anger and hate she felt from being sent away and isolated stained and seeped into the walls of the monastery, cursing it for eternity. After her eventual release, she went on to live until 1167, when it said her spirit returned to Mortimer Abbey to haunt the area as the White Lady. She is said to appear on nights close to a full moon, moaning as she drifts through the now ruins of the monastery. Those that have seen her report that she alternates between wearing black and white gloves. If she appears to you with white gloves on, you're destined for good luck. But if she appears with black, you'll be expected to pass within a year. Alas, Matilda is not the only spirit one must worry about if visiting the abbey. When the monastery was at its peak in the 1500s, a frail and suffering woman was brought to the monks with an illness it was believed that only they could aid. It was revealed that she was possessed by the spirit of a wolf and cursed to become a werewolf for several nights. The monks chained her to a room and conducted multiple exorcisms in an attempt to eradicate the spirit. The monks were able to exorcise the evil wolf spirit or demonic force out of the woman, but it then attached itself to the grounds and walls of the monastery. Several hundred years later, in 1884, a man named Roger Saboureau was hunting in the woods nearby when he was attacked by a large werewolf. He shot it multiple times, killing the creature, but when he returned home at dawn, he found the body of his wife bearing wounds matching those he had given the wolf. People say the spirit of Roger's wife and his own heartbroken spirit still wander the area when the moon is full. The abbey was exorcised by the church in 1921, but still remains haunted to this day. And coming in first place, we have the Abbey of the Black Hag, locally known as Monasterengalagduff. Please don't curse me for my pronunciation. St. Catherine's Abbey, or simply as Old Abbey. It's located roughly 2 miles east of the village of Shanagolden, in the townland of Old Abbey. Gee, can you tell where it got its name? One of the earliest recorded nunneries in Ireland, with its first official record being around 1298, it was built on land donated by John Fitzthomas, and has the typical layout for abbeys of its time, with a dining hall, cells, isolated meditation areas, and other rooms still able to be identified amongst the ruins today. During the 15th century, there was a major battle for supremacy in the area between the Earl Fitzgerald and the prestigious Butler family, of which the Earldom of Ormond belonged. It got to such an extent that the local bishop was known to pray for peace between the families at masses. During one of the nightly attacks, Earl Fitzgerald attempted to get his wife to safety, but as he was pulling her onto his horse, an arrow pierced her thigh, shattering the bone and spraying red bodily fluids. As he rode on, the Countess appeared to have succumbed to her injury, leading the Earl to seek sanctuary at St. Catherine's. The heartbroken man was certain his wife had passed, so he swiftly buried her beneath the altar and continued elsewhere to find safety. As the night went on, the nuns and residents began to hear hair-raising screams and made the decision to rebury the Countess in hopes of bringing her peace. When they dug up the body, they discovered her fingers were broken and her nails had been torn off. The poor woman had been buried alive, with a very slow and torturous end of her life. To this day, it is believed that the Countess has been unable to find peace and continues to scream in anguish, waiting for her husband to save her from a fate truly worse than death. Moving slightly ahead in time, we come to the Black Nun herself. Described as one in the order that wasn't content with being humble, helping others over herself, and the servitude to God, she instead craved power. The hag had her own cell, where she worshipped Satan and performed black magic, becoming a slave to the occult. This was the highest form of blasphemy in the church, and the other nuns in the order fled the abbey, while the hag remained in her now house of darkness. To complete her rituals, the Black Nun would venture into the local community and perform depraved, lewd acts and offer sacrifices, with bones of young community members later discovered on the grounds. In modern times, visitors have reported seeing the dark, shadowy figure of a nun wandering, the feeling of being constantly watched, and a disembodied hand reaching towards them. It has been reported that flashlights cannot function in the nun's cell, and modern batteries drain too quickly to have any sort of rational explanation.
Number 5. St. Mary the Virgin Church. Clop Hill, England. I gotta say, that sounds like it's a fake place, like where Sir Topham Hatt lives. Well, not only is it real, but it's home to a bone-chilling haunted church, St. Mary the Virgin Church. Now, St. Mary was built in 1350 outside the main settlement of totally real place Clop Hill. Traditionally, churches are built facing the east. I didn't know that. It's so it can align with the sun rising, which in Christianity is associated with heaven and the Messiah. Churches have their altars facing east, so you pray in that holy direction. Well, St. Mary's just had to be a little different, and this church is facing the west, facing away from God. And it's why some people believe the church is hosted to evil spirits, as facing west means they've shunned God and opened their doors to the devil. Paranormal investigators have strongly suspected the church as being host to satanic rituals. As the church fell into disuse, it became a popular spot for vandals, and if you believe the legends, black magic. In 1963, a local couple saw two people wandering around holding a human skull, which definitely I think would cause you to look twice. The people told the couple that they had found the skull in St. Mary's, where it had been jammed into a wall. When the couple went to investigate, they found on the floor a breastbone, pelvis, and leg bones, all laid out in a pattern used for black mass. Pretty spooky. Scattered cockerel feathers and tracings of two crosses filled in red were found inside the church as well. And as if that wasn't slightly unnerving enough, they also found that 6 graves of women in particular had been tampered with as well. All signs seem to be pointing towards some dark rituals happening at St. Mary's Church. Common sightings at the St. Mary's Church range from smaller scale things like strange screeching during the night or hearing the bell going off despite being long abandoned, and the more threatening reports seeing tall, dark figures wandering the ruins of the church, perhaps getting themselves ready for another ritual, or perhaps they've been contacted by a ritual and are arriving. Only thing I know is I won't be checking out the midnight mass there anytime soon.
Number 4 on this list is the St. Louis Cathedral, a beautiful church like many on this list, which is riddled with spirits. List first says, like the city it serves, the St. Louis Cathedral in New Orleans is a font of strange myths and legends. Originally built by the city's French rulers, the modern cathedral wasn't completed until the 1850s. According to lore, the ghosts of the old structure came along for the ride. One of the cathedral's better known ghosts, Père Dagobert, was an 18th century priest. Dagobert was renowned for his kindness, especially his willingness to treat the poor and terminally ill. During the 1760s, several members of his congregation decided to revolt against the city's new Spanish rulers. The mainly French and Creole rebels successfully pushed the initial Spanish force out of the city, but a larger force later managed to claim New Orleans for the Spanish king. Infuriated by the earlier rebellion, Irish-Spanish governor Alejandro O'Reilly decided to not only execute the rebels, but also leave their rotting bodies on the doorstep of the St. Louis Cathedral. As a devout Catholic, Dagobert could not stand by while Catholic bodies were so roughly treated. After failing to get O'Reilly's permission to properly bury the bodies, Dagobert led a funeral procession down to St. Peter's Cemetery and placed the slain men in unmarked graves. Dagobert's successor, a Spanish priest named Pierre Antoine, is also said to haunt the cathedral. More intriguingly, Antoine's friend, voodoo priestess Mary Laveau, who often prayed at the church during her lifetime, is also considered to be one of the many spirits inside the cathedral. So we got voodoo priestesses, unmarked haunted graves, multiple spirits of bodies that were buried improperly. This church is just one big mess. Many people think that there are also a bunch of other secrets that this place has that we don't know about. Like this was a spot for a secret society hundreds of years ago who performed some very questionable rituals, and that's why this place is as haunted as it is. Whatever really happened here, we know it was dark and we know that it left its mark. Number 3 on this list is Egg Hill Church. This church was home to one of the worst tragedies a church has ever been host to. I've never been a real churchgoer myself, but from my understanding, love, life, spirituality, all of this is supposed to be in the air when you go, and the whole reason for doing so. Death and hate and violence, that's all supposed to be left at the door. Pennsylvania's Egg Hill Church didn't quite do that. Instead, they invited death into the church on one particular Halloween night. Many years ago, the whole community gathered into the church on Halloween. The priest passed around bread and wine as is customary, but this bread and wine was a little off. In fact, it was very off. So off that everyone who had it died. It was poisoned. It's unknown whether the town had collectively decided to end their lives together that night or if this was all the priest's doing, but either way, tens to hundreds of people's bodies lay lifeless on the ground when it was all said and done. Now, what are we left with? Well, the ghosts of all of these people, obviously. Even worse than that, the spirit of this evil priest still lingers here too, and apparently, he isn't done with the living. He's said to be very dangerous and wants to drag visitors down with him and take their life. This whole story is pretty much as dark as you can get, and it's no wonder the place is totally messed up today. Number 2 on this list is St. Nicholas Church. Hey, it's me. It just so happens that my church is haunted by a dozen spirits. Great. List first says St. Nicholas Church is practically haunted by default. That's because the village of Pluckley, its home, is reputably the most haunted locale in all of England. The Kent village is home to the Watercress woman, who occupies the Pinnock Bridge, and to the ghost of a schoolmaster who committed in front of his pupils. According to a conservative estimate, Pluckley contains no fewer than 12 active spirits. The church itself is said to be the home of both the beautiful ghost of Lady Daring and the Lady in Red, a ghost who searches the adjacent churchyard for her lost baby. The ghost of a former miller who worked in the area is also said to haunt the churchyard in search of a long-lost love. Also, the ghost of a monk at nearby Greystone's house is also said to be seen during the night. Finally, visitors to St. Nicholas have reported seeing lights in the church's windows when no one was inside. So we have another church with just a plethora of horrible things. Someone taking their own life, a missing a man who has lost his loved one. My question is, why did all of this happen at this one church? Like, what really caused all of this to transpire in the first place? Are we just supposed to believe that it's all coincidence, or is there actually something more afoot here? I think that's the real secret, and sadly, I don't know if we're ever going to be able to find the true answer. And finally, number 1 on this list is St. Andres on the Red. Just that name alone. On the Red. Like, of course this place had to have some dark secrets. List first says St. Andrews on the Red, completed in 1849, is located in the town of Selkirk, which is more or less a suburb of Winnipeg. It's the oldest stone church in Western Canada, and it may be the region's most haunted thanks to the spirits of former plague victims. Other apparitions are said to populate the church's graveyard. Eyewitnesses have reported seeing a ghostly man clad in black and a mysterious woman in white. Also, a disembodied pair of red eyes have startled the visitors in the past, while a ghost car has been noted not far from the church's main entrance. If you're thinking about visiting the church or graveyard, be wary. Those who've claimed to have seen the various apparitions also reported having terrible nightmares the following nights. Most of these nightmares apparently involved the gates of the cemetery, which rattle even though no hands are seen shaking them. Some people can't shake these nightmares either. The occasional individual will have these persist for months or even years. I'm sure that the architecture and natural beauty is nice and all, but I'm not trying to risk nightmares for a year to see it. I do wonder what happened to those gates though. Is it some weird thing with the wind that's causing it, or is it what people suggest, some type of ghostly intervention? I tend to think some sort of spirit has to be involved, considering the thing with the nightmares happens as well, but you gotta wonder who. Sometimes I really do think that being a paranormal investigator would be awesome, because you could get to the bottom of these things, but then again, that's a pretty unforgiving profession. Number 5 on this list is the Templo Mayor ruins. So a church is typically defined as a place for Christian worship, but let's loosen up that definition just a little bit and start thinking about it as a building or landmark where people would have worshipped higher beings. If we start thinking about it like that, then the Templo Mayor ruins can certainly qualify. Mexico has a lot of haunted spots, but this is at the top of their list for sure. Gaurav Gupta writes, this archaeological site in Mexico has a blood-soaked past. It is a haunted Aztec civilization site that has made its presence felt throughout the time. Around 4,000 people were brutally killed to please Aztec gods. The priests would cut out the beating hearts from the victims' chests and then throw their lifeless bodies on the stairs of the Aztec temple. Aztec's last emperor, Cuauhtémoc, made his last stand invading Spanish armies before he was tortured and killed. This Aztec is now a museum, and tourists report strange sensational feelings and sightings of shadow figures. 4,000 people were likely sacrificed here. That is a truly absurd amount of sacrifices. Then throw on the fact that a great battle took place here, and you end up with so much death. Needless to say, the spirits of those that passed have never really left. Glowing orbs are always spotted at this place, especially in the evening. There have been reports of these glowing orbs touching the people and transporting them to the world of the dead. They go into a hypnotic state and can't move, sort of like what happens to people in the latest season of Stranger Things, if any of you have watched that. They have a very hard time explaining what has happened to them after the fact, but they know that it was the dead. This is accompanied by a giant beam of light that flashes into the sky. There is evil here, there just has to be. All of the death that has transpired over the years has left a horrible stain on this place, and evil has congregated here. No one knows what type of evil or what spirit is behind this, but just know that this is a scary place that you should probably avoid.
Coming in at 4, St. Andrews on the Red, Selkirk, Canada. Built between 1845 and 1849 to serve the local community of retired Hudson Bay Company personnel, this church is located in a small suburb of Winnipeg, located on a lightly forested hill with an incredibly impressive Gothic design. It is by far the oldest stone church in Western Canada and has definitely had its fair share of paranormal activity. The church became an old campfire story among young teens and rebellious kids who would dare their friends to walk backwards around the church 3 times, with the expectation that you would disappear. Now, of course, that never actually happened, but it was still a frightening tale to tell children so they didn't wander through the cemetery at night. Now, what makes this church truly chilling is that victims of influenza, diphtheria, typhoid, and tuberculosis from the early colonial era were interred here, and their restless spirits are said to still wander the grounds of the church. Specifically, some visitors have reported disembodied red eyes floating through the cemetery, organs playing spontaneously, as well as a mysterious woman cloaked in white who is known to rattle the gates of the church. If you dare, you can take a self-guided tour of the church located in Selkirk, Canada. Coming in at 3, St Michan's Church, Dublin, Ireland. This is an Anglican church built on the site of an early Norse chapel from 1095, with the current structure dating back to 1686, undertaken by William Robinson. As it stands, this church is the only parish church on the north side of the River Liffey, surviving from a Viking foundation. Now, the exterior of the church is nothing to write home about, however the interior is what we're going to be discussing, specifically the vaults. The vaults of St Michan's contain a large amount of mummified remains, with the walls of the vaults containing limestone, thus keeping the air dry and creating ideal conditions for preservation. Among the remains of the 400-year-old body of a nun, a 6.5-foot man believed to have been a crusader, a boy with a severed right hand and feet, and Henry and John Shears, who took part in the 1798 rebellion. Unfortunately, a number of the crypts in the church's vaults were damaged by vandals in 1996 and once again in 2019. After the most recent event, the church has stated that several mummified remains were desecrated by vandals, including the remains of the nun and the crusader. Tours used to be open, however, after the recent incident they have been temporarily shut down. Not only will you be dealing with the enraged spirits of the dead when visiting this church, but also the despicable living. Coming in at 2, Cathedral of the Assumption of Our Lady, Guadalajara, Mexico. Also known as the Guadalajara Cathedral, this is a Roman Catholic cathedral of the Archdiocese of Guadalajara and was built in 1541 in the Spanish Renaissance style with neo-Gothic spires. However, though the building is beautiful, it has been plagued by hauntings and tragic events. On May 30th, 1574, during Mass, neighbours fired shots into the air. Some of the bullets fell onto the cathedral and started a fire, ultimately damaging the building. A second tragic event struck in 1818 when an earthquake shook the city, causing the towers and dome to collapse. The cathedral was of course repaired, however it continues to be in danger. It was damaged by earthquakes in 1932, 1957, 1985, 1995 and 2003. However, outside of natural disasters, the cathedral also has a ghostly side to it. One of the most popular attractions is of course the Crypt of Archbishops, which is truly chilling. However, more chilling still are the mummified bodies on display there, with one dating back to the 1700s, which belongs to a child that was killed for converting to Catholicism. Some visitors to the cathedral have claimed that they have seen her eyes blink and have witnessed her hair move. Very spooky indeed. And finally, coming in at number 1, St Thomas Anglican Parish of Mulgoa, New South Wales, Australia. Designed by Reverend Thomas Mackison and built from 1836 to 1838, this church is incredibly striking with a Gothic revival design and is said to be one of the most haunted churches in not just Australia, but in the world. Though the church is youthful in appearance and located in a semi-rural area, it is hiding an incredibly dark and tragic history. Legend has it that 2 young boys died in a fire in the bell tower of the church after a prank went horribly wrong. Since that fateful day, any kind of light, even candles, anger the spirits of the boys' restless spirits. According to a Facebook group, Haunted Places of Sydney, they say, I quote, "There's an urban legend that claims that if you drive laps around the church at night, the headlights of your car will switch off, and if you continue, the car will stall." However, it isn't just the church's legend that is creepy. The surrounding cemetery is also filled with monuments that date back almost 200 years ago. With monuments that date back almost 200 years, adding to the creepy factor. As of right now, the church is owned by Anglican Church Property Trust and was added to the New South Wales State Heritage Register on April 2nd, 1999. Coming in at number 5, we have Oradour Church in France. Located in central France, a few miles from Limoges lies a now abandoned town called Oradour-sur-Glane. The town is now filled with empty houses, train lines that are out of order, and a sign of tragedy. With roadside walls pocked with bullet holes, fire marks, scorching stone houses, the church roof has gone through some massive explosion. This tragedy happened on June 10th,